Chapter 3 of Sinister House by Leland Hall. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Ben Tucker. Chapter 3. As I have told you, our house has every modern convenience. We have electric doorbells at every door, but whoever gave those resounding thwacks, they seemed resounding, I assure you, at that weird hour of the night and in that storm, was probably unable in the dark to find the button. So my mind reasoned in a second or two. You know, pounding on a door is a very threatening noise, and I confess I was startled. Annette was really alarmed. For a long while she would not loose my hand, but kept dragging at me, and I was very awkward trying to find the button of the lamp to my left. Once a little light in the room, however, she became cautious and alert. She would not let me leave my bed. Both of us sat up, and very strained we listened for the blows to come again. It seemed a long time that we waited. It was probably not more than a couple of minutes. At any rate, no sound but the roaring of the wind, the driving of the rain, and the flapping of the curtain by the open window assailed our ears. Suddenly I jumped out of bed, and, determined to find who had roused us so, made my way without slippers or gown into the northeast room, from the window of which I could lean out and spy. I didn't switch on any light because, as Annette said, that would have made me too good a target for anyone below. As I stumbled along, I heard my little son begin to cry. An unusual sound in our house and disconcerting at that hour. From the north window I could see nothing in the blackness of the night. I opened it cautiously, without making a sound, and leaned out. The very wall of the house beneath me was invisible. I might have been leaning over an unfathomable abyss. But through the noise of rain and wind my ear caught the sound of footsteps, heavy and slow, on the granolithic walk. "Who's there?" I challenged loudly. To my utter amazement, the voice which answered me, hushed but audible from out of the storm, was familiar. Pierre, I got you up. I'm sorry, I watched your light from half a mile down the road, hoping it would not go out. I was just going on." "For the love of heaven, Eric," I shouted back. "I'll be down in 2 shakes of a lamb's tail." Darting back to my room for my slippers, I switched on the living room lights from upstairs, and then I rushed down to let him in. He stepped over the threshold, dripping wet. I saw in a glance that his clothes were soaked through. They hung down heavily from his shoulders. I caught a glimpse, too, of a heavy dress suit case he left outside on the porch. "What's the matter, Eric?" I asked him, more than ever surprised to see standing before me a man I had thought was 1,000 miles away. "Nothing's the matter," he replied in his melodious and somewhat sad voice. He took off his hat with an apologetic sidelong smile. The rain ran in streams from it. "I didn't mean to rout you out, but somehow it's such a devilish night, and I wanted to get home quickly." "There's nothing the matter with Julia, is there?" I asked suddenly and without thinking. "With Julia?" he cried, his look transfixing me, and his deep-set brown eyes terribly anxious and searching. I am an idiot. Of course not. We left her not 2 hours ago. Never saw her looking so well. Never saw her livelier." That relieved him. He undid a button or two of his coat. I always noticed how lean and sensitive his hands were, and reached in for a handkerchief to mop his face. What an expressive wet face it was. He cleared his throat, putting his fingers to his mouth as he did so in a gesture characteristically apologetic. He was a tall, wiry, gaunt fellow, whose face fairly burned with eagerness at times, though he was a man of few words, rather mute. I suppose he was self-effacing, and extremely considerate of others rather than apologetic. Certainly there was no suggestion of weakness about him. He wasn't assertive or aggressive, but he had unusual power of endurance, both physical and, I found out later, mental. Weeks afterwards, Giles said of him that he was tempered in a white-hot resentment, but Giles was an incorrigible phrase-maker. Eric seemed to me just an attractive, magnetic, dark-eyed fellow, taller and thinner than the average and a good deal more what the women call sympathetic. Resentment was the last thing in the world I should have associated with Eric Greer. Well, I am rambling. Eric had never before been in our house without his wife, and I felt as if he were lonesome. All the time my son upstairs kept yelling as if he were scared out of his life. It was like Eric to take upon himself the blame of this, but I deprecated his apologies. One was always doing that with Eric. He told me then that he had found himself in Buffalo with 3 days on his hands, and had determined to take a flying trip to his home and his wife. "I can't bear being away from her," he added, but with no trace of apology there. He burned when he spoke of his wife. "And it's such a rotten night. I just got into Forsby from New York. There was no cab at the station, and I started to walk it. When I saw the light in your window, I hoped I'd get to your house before you had gone to bed, and that... Well, I have only 36 hours to spend with Julia at the best, and I thought you'd perhaps run me over in your car." He would have driven himself over, but I knew he couldn't manage a Ford very well, and besides I was glad to do him a favor, so I rushed upstairs to dress. There was something abroad in the night that took away all thought of sleep. Even Bobby kept up his whimpering, which was very unlike him. I stopped in his room a second to tell Annette, who was watching with him, that it was Eric who had roused us, and that I was going to run him over in the Ford. She had already assured herself of the nature of our midnight visitor. She thought I was a fool to drive him over in such a storm, that it would be much more sensible to keep him with us overnight. As a matter of fact, she didn't want to be left alone in the house. Bobby had had terrible nightmares. She couldn't wake him up. She thought he had a fever. You know how women are, even the best of them, like my wife. Just the same, I got dressed, forced a dry coat on Eric, cranked up the Ford, and started out in the storm. Eric paid no attention to the roughness of the way. While my mind was wholly intent upon steering the light car through the heavy mud and keeping her out of ruts, he asked me anxious questions about the condition of his wife. Now and then, when we came to a smooth stretch, I would say, you know how, with my mind only half in it, "She's as bright as a cricket. She's improved wonderfully." Or, as a joke, "She seems to thrive on your absence, Eric. I wonder if that pleased him." Perhaps he didn't hear anything I said, with the wind roaring about us. At any rate, he couldn't get enough out of me. He even asked me if she was sleeping better. What a question from one husband to another. I answered, like a top. I never knew she had slept in any other way. All the way, the rain was bouncing and running all over the windshield and steaming on the engine hood. The wind was trying to tear the top off the car, and the whole shebang was rocking and pitching along the road like a bump the bumps at Coney Island. Even the lights got to playing tricks. From time to time, the rain or something reflected them in a queer way, so that it seemed to me as if a ball of light or a sort of thick string of it were flying along just ahead of us, now just over the engine, now right on the edge of the windshield. It was so queer that it made me jumpy and nervous. I found the next morning that the reflector in the right lamp was broken. That accounted for it simply enough, but I remember how I jumped when we turned down into Eric's driveway in that uncanny light. It was like an eel then, darted ahead of us and round the corner as if it were alive. At Eric's request, I stopped the car under the hemlocks, some little way from the house, and, as luck would have it, I stalled the engine doing so. That left us in absolute darkness, and it felt and sounded as if the wind and rain doubled their fury. What a friend to man is light. I don't know why I insisted on stumbling along with Eric towards where we knew the house must be if the storm hadn't blown it from the edge of the cliff into the river. We didn't know where to put our feet, and in the darkness the wind sounded like all sorts of unearthly things. Once it was so like an anguished human cry that we both stopped, trembling. I'm not sure now that it wasn't. We kept on going, trying to feel the edge of the driveway with our feet. Of course, we couldn't see a sign of the house. Finally, I said to Eric, "This is absurd. I'll go back and start the engine. That will give us some light, and you've got to wake Julia anyhow." Though he remonstrated, I had already turned when I heard the noise of bolts shot back with a loud click. We were much nearer the house than we knew. The front door was suddenly thrown open, and I saw Julia standing in the doorway. She wore a long white nightgown, and she carried in her hand a lighted candle. She was the only visible thing in the night, save right before me the clear-cut but lightless edge of Eric's face. Behind her there was a sort of rosy glow. She must have lighted a lamp back in the narrow hallway, one wall of which I remembered was hung with a damask of deep rose color. She cried out, "Who's there?" And though she was not more than 10 feet from us, I could hardly hear her voice over the noise of the storm. Eric answered her, almost with a sob, and sprang towards her across the lawn and up the steps. He had her caught up in his arms in a second, and she let the candle fall. In an instant the night was black again, save for that rosy glow, against which I saw their two figures almost as one, shapeless, yet strangely heroic, like two wanderers standing embraced on the edge of a cliff far above the fires of earth. Slipping and almost falling in the mud, I ran back to my Ford. I bumped good and hard into a tree trunk before I got there, but I had her cranked and backing before they could have thought of me, and I doubt if even the glare of my lights over their lawn or the roar of the engine in reverse recalled to their minds that there was such a man as Pierre Smith living in the world. The house was still as death when I got back, and I tried to sneak into bed without a sound. But the wife of my bosom was on a still watch, and in the dark she tried to pump me for all she could get, and that being little for her pains, she fell to thinking that Eric and Julia were both crazy nuts. Not an elegant phrase, but expressive. It was after 2 before I fell asleep. Just drowsing away, I remembered to ask Annette how Bobby was. He had had terrible nightmares, but had dropped off to sleep again as soon as Eric and I had left the house. He had no fever. End of chapter 3.